My name is Yvonne. I am 68 years old, and my occupation is a retired pediatric nurse. For 4 long years, I lived in a quiet, agonizing exile after my own flesh and blood threw me out of my home for a quick inheritance. I truly thought my life was over, and that the pain of their betrayal would be the end of me. But then a frantic, trembling voice on the other end of an early morning phone call revealed a hidden truth. A single document that was about to strip them of every single penny they thought they had won. The jarring ring of my cell phone shattered the peace of my tiny apartment right at 7 in the morning. I stared at the unknown number on the screen for a long moment before finally answering. On the line was a high-priced real estate attorney, and he was stammering through his words so fast he could barely catch his breath. The sheer panic radiating from his voice was unmistakable. He was calling about my son, Marcus, and my daughter, Deja. These were the children who had kicked me to the curb like yesterday's garbage 4 years ago, leaving me with nothing but a few trash bags full of my clothes. Now, according to this desperate lawyer, they were staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. Everything they had stolen from me was collapsing around them, and the only thing that could save them from absolute disaster was a single signature from the mother they had discarded. I listened to the man beg on behalf of my son. I did not interrupt him. I did not cry. I just sat there at my small kitchen table, slowly sipping my black coffee. I felt the warmth of the mug against my palms, and a deep, steady calm washed over my entire body. I am not the frail, weeping woman they threw away. The physical sensation of holding all the power, after feeling completely powerless for so long, was intoxicating. I took another slow sip of my coffee, letting the heavy silence on the line stretch out, forcing that expensive attorney to sweat and wait. My children thought my kindness was weakness. They mistook a mother's blind trust for foolishness. They were about to learn that while my love for them was once unconditional, my dignity is not something they can steal. I survived their ultimate betrayal, and now I was finally ready to deliver a masterclass in consequences. Before this nightmare began, I was just a mother who lived and breathed for her family. When Marcus and Deja were born, they became the absolute center of my universe. I was a pediatric nurse, a job that demanded everything from me, both physically and emotionally. For over 30 years, I worked grueling 12-hour night shifts, walking those hard hospital floors until my feet went numb. I would come home just as the sun was coming up, my entire body aching and my back screaming for rest, only to stand at the kitchen counter packing their lunches and making sure they got on the school bus safely. I missed more Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas mornings than I care to count. While other families were gathered around the table carving the turkey, I was at the hospital holding the hands of sick children, praying my own were happy and safe at home. Every single dollar I earned that did not go toward keeping a roof over our heads went directly into their future. My husband Darius and I made a vow early on that our children would never start their adult lives drowning in crippling student loan debt. We wore the same worn-out winter coats for a decade. We skipped anniversary trips and summer vacations. We stretched every meal and carefully clipped every coupon we could find in the Sunday paper. When Marcus got accepted into a top university and Deja decided to follow suit, I wept with absolute pride. I gladly put my own dreams of traveling and finally relaxing on permanent hold to build a rock-solid foundation for their futures. I poured every ounce of my youth and energy into making sure they had the very best start in life. I never once complained because to me their success was my ultimate reward. I loved them with a fierce, unconditional devotion that left absolutely no room for doubt or regret. I truly believed that the love and sacrifice you pour into your children is the exact same love they will pour back into you when you eventually need them. I was so incredibly proud of the successful, educated adults they had become. completely blind to the selfish entitlement that was quietly festering right beneath the surface. That blind faith carried me all the way to the darkest day of my life. 5 years ago, my beloved Darius passed away suddenly from a massive heart attack. Losing him felt like the ground had been completely ripped right out from under my feet. We had spent 35 years building a beautiful life together, culminating in our absolute dream home nestled in the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of Atlanta. It was a sprawling, beautiful property filled with warm memories. A huge backyard where Darius loved to garden, and a wide wrap-around porch where we had planned to sit side by side and spend our golden years growing old together. That house was so much more than just bricks and mortar to me. It was a living monument to our decades of hard work and sacrifice. It was my personal sanctuary, meant to be my secure and peaceful safe haven in my old age. Standing at the cemetery on the day we buried the love of my life, the grief was so heavy I could barely breathe or stand up straight. But my children were right there beside me, physically holding me up. Marcus wrapped his strong arms tightly around my shoulders, and Deja held my trembling hands in hers. They looked me in the eyes with tears streaming down their own faces and promised me over and over that I would never be alone. They swore to Darius right there at his grave that they would always take care of Mama. They told me to rest, to let them handle the heavy lifting from now on, and to just focus entirely on healing my shattered heart. I leaned deeply into their embrace, completely comforted by their soothing words. I had absolute unwavering and naive faith in my children. I truly believed they were my ultimate safety net in a cruel world. I thought all those grueling years of sacrifice had forged an unbreakable bond of deep family loyalty. I could not see that their comforting words were entirely hollow. I could not see that while I was mourning the loss of my husband, they were already looking at my beloved sanctuary and calculating its exact market value. That foolish trust set the tragic stage for a devastating awakening as my pure maternal intentions were about to collide violently with their growing, greedy entitlement. The nightmare truly began 4 years ago on a dreary Tuesday afternoon. I was still lost deeply in the suffocating fog of my grief, desperately trying to find some small sense of peace in the quiet, empty rooms of my sprawling home. Marcus, Deja, and my daughter-in-law Keisha all showed up completely unannounced. They guided me into the kitchen and sat me down at my own table, the very same table where Darius and I had shared 1,000 morning meals. At first, they played the part of the deeply concerned children perfectly. Keisha reached across the polished wood surface and gently held my hand, her voice dripping with a carefully rehearsed sweetness that I was simply too exhausted to see through. She started talking about my physical health, saying they were losing sleep, worrying about me living all alone in such a massive space. Then the conversation took a sharp and calculated turn. Keisha leaned in close and began feeding me terrifying stories about Medicare expensive nursing homes and how the state could suddenly swoop in and seize the entire estate if I ever fell severely ill. She painted a horrifying picture of ruthless government agents taking everything Darius and I had worked so hard to build, leaving my children with absolutely nothing to show for it. Marcus and Deja sat right there, nodding along in perfect unison, adding their own heavy sighs of fake worry. They cornered me in my absolute lowest moment of vulnerability. Before my tired mind could even fully process what was happening, Marcus slid a thick legal document across the smooth oak table. It was a quitclaim deed. Keisha aggressively pushed a heavy pen into my trembling fingers, insisting that signing the property over to Marcus right then and there was the absolute only guaranteed way to protect our family legacy. They bullied me, and guilt-tripped me without a single ounce of mercy. They forcefully reminded me of all the immense sacrifices I had always claimed to make for them, demanding to know why I would hesitate now when their rightful inheritance was on the line. I was so incredibly tired down to my very bones. The crushing weight of my grief was entirely blinding, and I just wanted their relentless pressure to stop. Out of pure exhaustion and a blind, unwavering trust in the children I had raised from birth, I signed my name on that dotted line. I willingly handed over the keys to my kingdom, foolishly believing I was securing their bright future. I did not read the fine print, because you do not expect your own flesh and blood to set a trap for you. The devastating truth of what I had just done was revealed exactly 3 short days later. The ink on that legal document was barely dry when the masks completely fell off. I had gone out to the local grocery store for an hour to pick up a few simple things to cook for dinner. I pulled my car into the familiar driveway of the home I had lived in for decades, and my heart completely stopped in my chest. There, piled up carelessly on my beautiful wrap around front porch, were dozens of heavy black plastic garbage bags. I got out of the car, my legs shaking uncontrollably, and walked up the front steps. I ripped open the top bag and saw my favorite clothes, my framed family photographs, and my most precious personal keepsakes just thrown inside like worthless trash. The front door abruptly swung open, and Keisha stood there blocking the entrance. The fake sweetness from a few days ago was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stare that chilled me directly to the bone. She looked me right in the eyes and said without a single ounce of pity that they needed the space for the new baby and that I was better off in a senior apartment. I begged to speak to my son. Marcus stepped out from behind his wife, refused to make eye contact with me, and quietly told me that Keisha was right and that it was time for me to go. The visceral pain of that exact moment was absolutely unbearable. My entire body trembled violently as I stood on the porch of the house I built, realizing that my own children had just legally stolen my beloved sanctuary. The severe heartbreak physically dropped me to my knees, right there on the concrete. The utter shock of being so easily discarded by the people I loved most left me entirely speechless. The tension escalated rapidly as Keisha handed me a folded piece of paper with an address on it, telling me they had paid the first month of rent for a place across town and that a taxi was already on the way. I was brutally forced out of my massive, beautiful home and shoved into a cramped, depressing one-bedroom rental apartment overlooking a noisy highway. Once the door to that tiny apartment clicked shut behind me, the silence was deafening. They changed their phone numbers. They blocked me on everything. In the blink of an eye, I was entirely cut off from the family I had bled for, left alone to rot while they enjoyed my stolen paradise. For the first 6 months in that tiny apartment, I drowned in a dark and suffocating depression. The walls of that cheap rental felt like they were slowly closing in on me every single day. I spent my hours curled up on a second-hand sofa, staring blankly at the peeling paint on the ceiling, while the relentless roar of highway traffic rattled the single-pane windows. I cried until my eyes were swollen shut and my voice was completely hoarse. I mourned the loss of my children just as deeply as I had mourned the death of my husband. They were still alive, but the greedy people they had become were total strangers to me. The betrayal cut so deep that it physically hurt to draw a breath. But the turning point in this nightmare did not come with a dramatic screaming match or a desperate plea for them to love me again. It came on a rainy Tuesday morning with a moment of quiet and cold, strategic clarity. I realized I was letting them destroy me without laying a single finger on my body. I slowly sat up and wiped the dried tears from my face. The heavy fog of victimhood began to lift, and a fierce survivor instinct finally took its absolute place. I walked over to the small cardboard box of belongings I had managed to keep and pulled out a heavy steel lockbox. It contained all of Darius and his meticulous financial records. When my husband was alive, He handled all the complex legal paperwork for our family. He was a deeply protective man who always planned for the worst possible scenarios. I unlocked the heavy metal latch and began pulling out thick stacks of old legal documents. I spread them all out across the tiny kitchen table and began to read every single line with a sharp and unyielding focus. I stopped crying and started studying. The narrative of my life shifted in that exact moment, from a grieving widow drowning in sorrow to a wronged mother building a calculated defense. I spent hours poring over the complicated legal jargon until I found the original property deeds and the estate planning documents Darius had finalized a decade ago. As my eyes scanned the final pages of his heavy estate binder, a massive realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. I discovered the exact and complex nature of the estate. Darius had quietly set up to protect me before he passed away, and the absolute brilliance of my late husband suddenly illuminated the dark room and changed the entire trajectory of my future. I was no longer a victim, but a survivor ready for war. The massive plot twist, sitting right there on my cramped kitchen table, was almost too beautiful to believe. Years ago, my brilliant husband Darius had quietly placed our beautiful home into an ironclad, irrevocable living trust. He did this specifically to protect our assets from any outside interference or sudden financial disasters. I read the legal terms over and over again to make absolutely sure my tired eyes were not deceiving me. The document clearly stated that I am the sole and lifetime controlling trustee of the estate. I have total and absolute authority over the property until the day I die. This meant that the intimidating quitclaim deed that Marcus and Keisha had mercilessly bullied me into signing on that dreary afternoon was legally useless. It was nothing more than a worthless piece of scrap paper. You cannot quitclaim a property you do not technically own as an individual, because the trust owned the house and not me personally. My coerced signature held absolutely no legal weight whatsoever. They had essentially stolen a massive house that they had zero legal right to claim. In that moment, a lesser woman might have immediately hired an aggressive lawyer to storm over there and serve them with eviction papers. I could have easily fought them right then and there to take my sanctuary back, but the deep wounds they had inflicted on my soul demanded a much heavier price. Instead of fighting them immediately, I chose the ultimate and punishing silence. I decided to let their own greed become the very weapon that would destroy them. I kept entirely quiet and watched from afar as their unchecked arrogance took complete control of their lives. I drove past my old neighborhood in the evenings, parking down the street in the shadows, just to observe the massive changes they were making. I watched as Marcus, egged on by Keisha and Deja, began to completely tear apart the home I built. Through mutual acquaintances in town, I learned the staggering details of their grand plans. They boldly took out $300,000 in high-interest personal loans to completely gut and renovate the property. I sat in my car and watched construction crews tear down walls, rip out my beautiful garden, and install expensive modern fixtures. They were rapidly turning my peaceful suburban sanctuary into a massive modern mansion. They were hosting lavish parties and bragging loudly to anyone who would listen about their incredible real estate success. I watched them laugh and celebrate their stolen wealth. I let them pour their borrowed money, their precious time, and their boundless arrogance into a massive house they do not actually own. Every single nail they hammered and every expensive tile they laid was quietly adding to the immense trap they were building for themselves. I smiled in the dark, knowing that their absolute financial ruin was only a matter of time. I did not shed another tear for the children I once knew. I just waited patiently in the shadows while they foolishly decorated a cage of their own making. Their stolen victory was entirely fake, and my silent revenge was going to be absolutely spectacular. They had no idea that a massive storm was brewing just beyond their newly painted walls, ready to strike. That brings us exactly back to this morning and the frantic phone call that shattered the silence of my tiny apartment. The high-priced lawyer on the other end of the line was completely out of breath as he desperately explained the massive crisis that was rapidly unfolding. Marcus and Keisha had apparently decided that the $300,000 they borrowed to renovate my beautiful home was simply not enough wealth for them. Their boundless greed pushed them to try and flip the newly renovated property for an absolutely massive profit. They had boldly signed a legally binding contract to sell the estate to a ruthless luxury real estate developer for a staggering $1.2 million. They had already started spending the imaginary profits, planning lavish vacations and buying expensive cars. But their entire house of cards violently collapsed during the final closing process yesterday afternoon, when the title company pulled the official public records to transfer the ownership to the developer. The absolute bombshell finally dropped. The meticulous title search clearly proved that Marcus did not own the property. The irrevocable living trust owned the house, and I was the sole living trustee. The luxury developer was absolutely furious that they had tried to sell him a property they did not legally own. He was now aggressively threatening a massive lawsuit for real estate fraud, promising to drag their names through the mud. To make matters infinitely worse, the local bank that had issued the $300,000 in high-interest personal loans caught wind of the failed sale. The bank was immediately calling in the massive debt in full. My son and my daughter-in-law were suddenly facing immediate financial bankruptcy and very real potential criminal charges for grand larceny and fraud. The lawyer on the phone was literally begging me to drive down to his office immediately. He pleaded with me to sign the official trust dissolution papers to save my children from complete destruction. He promised me that Marcus would give me a small portion of the sale money if I just helped them escape this massive legal trap. I let him finish his desperate speech. Then I calmly took a breath, told him absolutely not, and hung up the phone. I sat back in my chair and let the profound reality of their failure wash over me. Exactly 1 hour after I hung up the phone with that panicked attorney, there was a frantic and heavy pounding on my apartment door. I slowly walked over and pulled the door open. Marcus, Keisha, and Deja were standing right there in the narrow hallway. The power dynamic that existed 4 years ago in my kitchen was now completely and utterly inverted. They looked absolutely pathetic. The arrogant confidence they had worn so proudly was entirely gone, replaced by a raw and suffocating panic. Marcus fell to his knees right there on the cheap carpet of the hallway. He was sobbing uncontrollably, begging me to listen to him and desperately trying to call me Mama again. He kept apologizing for everything he had done. Deja was standing behind him with thick black mascara running down her cheeks, wringing her hands and crying about how they had made a terrible mistake that was going to ruin their entire lives. But the most satisfying sight of all was Keisha, the cold and calculating woman who had ruthlessly ordered me out of my own home and thrown my beloved belongings on the porch, was now violently trembling in total fear. She could barely look me in the eyes. She kept stammering about how they were going to lose absolutely everything and how she could not go to jail because of her young child. I stood tall in the doorway of my depressing little apartment and just watched them crumble. The emotional climax of 4 long years of silent suffering hit me with a beautiful wave of complete vindication. They finally realized that their cruel manipulation and boundless entitlement had directly trapped them in a permanent cage of their own making. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I just looked at the 3 strangers sobbing on my doorstep and felt absolutely nothing for them. They had built their lavish dreams on the foundation of my broken heart, and now the heavy weight of their own greed was crushing them into the dirt. I looked down at my weeping son and delivered my final and uncompromising response. I told them in a very quiet and steady voice that I absolutely refused to sign a single piece of paper to save them. I reminded them that 4 years ago, they decided I was disposable trash, and today they get to live with the exact consequences of that terrible choice. I slowly closed the door in their crying faces and locked it tight. By noon that exact same day, I had hired my own ruthless attorney. I immediately filed the necessary legal paperwork to formally and legally evict them from my property. Because they had absolutely no legal right to the home, they were violently forced out onto the street in less than 30 days. They were left completely stranded, with hundreds of thousands of dollars in crushing personal bank debt for the expensive renovations they had unknowingly gifted entirely to my trust. The fraud investigation ruined their credit and their public reputations forever. Once they were permanently gone from my life, I took full control of the estate. I put the beautiful and newly upgraded property on the market myself. Thanks to all of their incredibly expensive and modern renovations, the home sold instantly for a massive $1.2 million is in pure cash. I took every single penny of that money and bought myself a gorgeous and peaceful beachfront condo in sunny Florida, hundreds of miles away from the painful memories of Atlanta. I wake up every single morning now and drink my fresh coffee while listening to the soothing ocean waves. My personal sanctuary and my human dignity have been completely and permanently reclaimed. I survived the absolute darkest betrayal a devoted mother could ever face, and I emerged stronger and far wealthier than I ever imagined. Meanwhile, the people who coldly tried to destroy me are left permanently drowning in the dark and heavy consequences of their own absolute greed. If there is one painful truth I have learned from this entire ordeal, it is that true family is built entirely on mutual respect and never just on shared blood. As mothers, we are conditioned from the very beginning to believe that our love must always be a sacrificial lamb for our children. But while a mother's love might be deep and unconditional, her hard-earned financial assets and her personal dignity are absolutely not free for the taking. You cannot allow anyone to treat you like a stepping stone just because they share your last name. To all the strong, older women listening to my voice right now, please hear me clearly. You have earned the right to live the rest of your life in absolute peace. Do not ever be afraid to set ironclad boundaries and protect your sanctuary at all costs because you are worth protecting. It is never an easy decision to choose yourself over the very people you raised from birth. But sometimes it is the absolute only way to truly survive. The healing process begins the exact moment you decide to take your power back. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace? I want to read all about your experiences. Tell me your story in the comments below because our shared truth is what makes this community so incredibly strong. Let me know what city or state you are watching from today so I can see how far this message has traveled. And if you have been watching for a while, please leave a so I know exactly who my true supporters are. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so we can keep sharing these journeys together.